Okay, everybody, time to begin. It's nice to see you all, and hope you had a great time on 10-day outreach. I've heard some great reports of different teams, so well done. Probably stretched you and all kinds of stuff. Just 1 week to go, and then cheerio. Woo! You know, one year when I was the principal, we had a time thing just clicking down on top of the stage, you know, with days and hours and minutes and seconds, and that got the big thumbs down, so we abandoned that. Just before we pray, let me remind you where we are, because it's been, you know, quite a while since we met together. Lots of stuff has flowed under the bridge. We are looking at 1 Samuel chapter 25, so perhaps you could turn to that, just to remind yourself. And we said, sure you remember, that 1 Samuel chapter 25 is sandwiched between chapter 24 and chapter 26. And we said in chapter 24, David demonstrates incredible grace, kindness, forgiveness, generosity of spirit to Saul. When Saul goes into the cave and David's 600 men are urging him, slit the guy's throat. And David refuses to do it. That's chapter 24. And then chapter 26, jumping over the chapter we're going to complete this first session. Chapter 26, a very similar event. Saul and his elite soldiers have come out to kill David. And David and Abishai stand over Saul, who's asleep in his camp, with all of his henchmen around him. And Abishai picks up a javelin to pin Saul to the ground, and David stops him. What an incredibly gracious, forgiving, kind person. Then we hit the chapter in the middle, chapter 25, which is almost unbelievable, because David is annoyed at Nabal, who's refused to pay David's men for protecting his flocks. And so David just loses it and gets a whole bunch of armed men, and they're heading towards Nabal, not only to kill him, but to kill every male in his household. And so we're looking at the subject of blind spots. And you and I have blind spots. Hello? You have blind spots. And so do I. And the problem is, with blind spots, we don't even suspect that we have them. And so, having looked at the reality of blind spots, we then examined the reasons for blind spots. And without looking at your notes, I'd just like you in pairs very quickly to see how many of those 5 reasons you can remember. What we did was we looked at the physical realm and thought about blind spots in the everyday life, and then transition that to say, spiritually, are there parallels? And of course there are. So if you go for it, I'll just give you a minute maximum to see if you can remember. Not if you can read from your notes, but if you can remember what those 5 reasons for blind spots were that we looked at. Okay, go for it. Okay, here are the 5 that we looked at. We looked at, first of all, the way that we are hardwired, the way we are made as people. And we looked at the blind spot at the back of your eye. Then we had a look at the way that we are programmed, the way we've been trained to look at things, which gives us blind spots. We then looked at the way we don't look at things. We think we know all about something, so we don't really look at it. Oh, I've heard this before. Why bother looking again? I've arrived at my conclusions. Why bother looking at a different view? Then we also looked at the fact that some things are hidden and covert and cloaked. And we said that Satan does that in the spiritual realm, just as much as that happens in physical warfare. And then the final one we mentioned was that some things are quite complex. And I left you with two puzzles, which I'm now going to give you the answer to. I often wonder whether it's worth giving you the answer to these, because those who are interested in the answer will have already probably checked it out online or talked to somebody else, and would be tempted when I said who figured it out to put their hand up, when really the question would be who gave you the answer. And then folk who haven't worked it out yet or checked it out couldn't care less anyway. So really quickly, that one you remember, the guys with the different hats on. The gentleman who gives the answer is the middleman on the left with the red hat. And that is because of what he doesn't hear. The man behind him can see two people in front of him, one with a black hat, one with a red hat. He knows that there are two red hats and two black hats. Because he's looking, the man at the back is seeing a black hat and a red hat. He doesn't know what hat's on his head. He hasn't enough information. But if the guys in front of him had two black hats on, then he would have said, I've got a red hat on. Okay? The fact that he doesn't say what's on his head alerts the man in the middle to the fact that he must be seeing two different coloured hats, therefore I must have a red hat on. It is really quite simple, but it takes quite a lot of seeing when you're starting from ground zero. Okay, that is an illustration of lateral thinking, by the way. Lateral thinking is a program of addressing problems in a different way than the way we normally address them. We are trained in the West to think linearly. We go from A to B to C to D. And the problem is when we face a problem, we try and work it out linearly. That is like me saying, somewhere in this room, $1 million has been buried. Here's a spade. I give each of you a spade. Start digging. If you start digging in the wrong place, it doesn't matter how deep you dig, you won't find the treasure. Sometimes you've got to ask yourself, how am I trying to address this problem? Now, is there a different way of addressing it? And in this issue, you have to ask, it's a counterintuitive question, what am I not being told? When I ask, what am I not being told, i.e. the guy behind me saying nothing, that gives you additional information. Lateral thinking is, get a book on it. It's absolutely fantastic. Many of the discoveries on this planet come through people who've trained themselves in lateral thinking. And then we had the second puzzle, you remember, with the guy trying to send a valuable ring through the post. And we said anything that was not in a locked container, whatever was in an open container would be stolen. And I said that the guy had as many tin boxes as you want, and the gal had as many tin boxes as you want, and they each had, maybe I didn't stress this, but actually not stressing this made the problem easier for you. I usually say the guy has as many padlocks as you want, and the gal has as many padlocks as you want. Actually, that's superfluous information. You don't need that. That's another factor of lateral thinking. Often you are confused by the amount of data that you're given. And you're given, in a problem, lots of the stuff is not relevant to solving the problem. So here's how they do this. It's dead simple. He puts the ring in his metal box. He puts the hasp, that's at the bottom. He puts it over the little hole on the side of the box. He puts his padlock through and he locks it. And he sends it to her. When she gets it, she gets her padlock and she puts her padlock through the same hasp and locks it. So now it's got two padlocks on. She sends it back to him. He takes his padlock off, and then her padlock is still there holding the thing. He sends it back to her, and she unlocks her padlock. And that is one of the ways that data is encrypted on the internet. It's exactly the same principle. Okay? So once you see something, it's often quite easy. But until you see it, you think, boy, I can't even figure that out. All right, then we moved on to the rationalization of blind spots, and we did that quite quickly at the end of our last session. So what I wanted to look at now was the recognition of blind spots. And remember, now we are thinking exclusively of blind spots in our life in terms of how we do life, in terms of relationships, in terms of spiritual truth, in terms of theology, in terms of doctrine. You have blind spots. I do. We all do. And recognizing them is extremely difficult. My view is that most people have no idea how hard it is to see, recognize, own up to a blind spot. It is extraordinarily difficult. I don't want you to show you, put your hand up, but I wonder how many of you have ever met somebody who is a conspiracy theorist. Somebody who has a view which is the opposite view to most people on the planet. And so, for instance, it might be Lady Diana was not killed in an accident, Princess Diana, beg your pardon, was not killed in an accident in an underpass in Paris. It was MI6 that rigged that. The royal family were getting fed up with her, and so they planned for her to be killed. You may never have met people who hold that view. You are very fortunate. Or you met people who say, you know what, 9/11 was not the way that the American government presented it. 9/11 was actually masterminded by people in America. Pardon? You may not have heard that view. I've got a friend, and this guy absolutely, passionately is convinced that America never put a man on the moon. And if you've ever tried to talk to anybody who holds a view like that, it's talk to the hand because the face ain't listening. Basically, usually people who hold a view like that, with the greatest respect, know zero about what they are describing. They'll quote all kinds of stuff that they read on the internet. If you ask them, could you explain that to me, please? They don't have a sweet clue. And so a friend of mine, he says, oh, well, human beings could never have got through the Van Allen belts. It's a scientific fact. And if I said to him, could you explain to me, please, what the Van Allen belts are? Could you explain to me the different particles in the Van Allen belts? Could you explain to me the different kinds of radiation there? Can you tell me what forms of radiation are dangerous to people? Can you tell me how long they have to be exposed to it? What intensity? Can you explain to me the different strengths in the Van Allen belt? Now let me explain to you how the Americans got round the Van Allen belt or went through a very thin area of it. I tell you, I might as well be speaking Chinese mixed in Swahili for all that the guy hears. I'm not kidding. It's like you can see the shutters come down because I saw something on YouTube with this world expert who said you can't get through the Van Allen belt. You check up who the world expert is. He's a journalist. He knows diddly squat about particle physics. But he's speaking as though he's an expert. People who have blind spots cannot see them, and you are belting your head against a brick wall trying to tell them. I've spoken to people who hold theological views that you cannot support from Scripture. And I've given them maybe this is nobody here, by the way, I've given them some research papers, and they don't even read them. They don't even read the things. And I'm thinking, why do you hold the view so strongly when you know so little about it? When I became a Christian, one of the things I was taught, which is a blind spot, was this. Build your experience on your theology. Do not build your theology on your experience. You may well have heard that. And if you hear it 50 times, it's right up there with the book of Romans or something, because you've been programmed with that. Now, there is some truth in that. The idea about build your experience on your theology, not the reverse way, is to stop crackpots. It's to stop crackpots who, as we've said once before, have more words from God on a Tuesday afternoon than the Apostle Paul did in a lifetime. You know, people who angels are telling them stuff, voices are telling them, I sense this is the Lord, etc. All that kind of language. And you try and, a person like that, the problem is that their experiences, spurious or otherwise, are fashioning their belief system. So I get the value of build your experience on your theology, not the other way around. However, what happens if your theology is wrong? What happens if you believe stuff passionately that is wrong? Is somebody going to come along and correct you by saying, well, let's look at the scriptures together. Let's do an in-depth study on. No, because they're not interested in that. Saul of Tarsus, 2,000 years ago. If you had tried to correct Saul of Tarsus's theology by opening a Bible and looking at passages in the Old Testament about the Messiah suffering, you may as well have been speaking in Chinese because he wouldn't have listened to you. In fact, he would either have put you in prison or applauded as you were being stoned to death. It is very, very, very hard to recognize your own blind spots. And so Saul of Tarsus has an encounter, an experience with Jesus on the road to Damascus that points out his blind spots. Who are you, Lord? I'm Jesus who you are persecuting. Points out his blind spots and changes his theology. For many of us, our theology is much more influenced by our experience or our lack of experience than we actually acknowledge. Very hard to recognize our own blind spots. Don't know how many of you have seen the movie Titanic, where the boat is just goes straight into an iceberg and sinks. And somebody said of the captain on the Titanic, on the bridge, 30 years of experience was working against him. That guy had been a captain for 30 years. So there's nothing that I don't know about ships and about icebergs and about weather, etc. He happened to have a blind spot. The result was a boat goes to the bottom of the Atlantic. So you'll find in chapter 25 many references to God alerting David to his blind spot. God actually did something. I've put the references up there. Let me just read them. 1 Samuel 25, verse 26. This is Abigail speaking to David. Please look at the text so you see what I'm saying is in the Bible. I'm not just kind of flinging out words. 1 Samuel 25, verse 26. Abigail says to David, "Now since the Lord has kept you, my master, from bloodshed, and from avenging yourself with your own hands." Or verse 32, this is David talking to Abigail. You remember she comes and alerts him to that he shouldn't be doing what he's planning to do. He shouldn't be planning to wipe out every male in the household of Nabal. And 1 Samuel 25, verse 32, David says to Abigail, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me." Or verse 34, "Otherwise, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, who has kept me from harming you." Or verse 39, "When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, 'Praise be to the Lord who upheld my cause against Nabal for treating me with contempt. He, the Lord, has kept his servant from doing wrong.'" So David has recognized God has revealed to him a blind spot. And I would urge you regularly in your prayers to be asking the Lord, "Father, please point out to me areas where I just don't see stuff, even though it's right in front of me." It might be about me. It might be about theology. It might be about doctrine. It might be about how I respond to situations. Here's the second thought. We almost always need the help of other people to see our blind spots. It's very interesting that the Lord used Abigail to warn David and to show him that what he was doing was so wrong. Now, what I'd like you to do, please, is to get into groups of 4. And I'm going to put those references up again. Don't worry, they're going to come up. In groups of 4, I would like you, please, I'm just going to give you maybe 5 minutes for this, to look specifically at the verses that are there. They're on the screen. Chapter 25, verses 18 and 19, verse 23, and verse 41. And I want you to think deeply. I want you to think outside the box. I want you to, ask yourself questions as you look at these verses. First question, what things can we see about Abigail, her actions, her words, and wisdom that enabled her to effectively confront David's blind spots? There are a lot of statements about Abigail in the text. So, for instance, why is it mentioned that she was very beautiful? Why is it mentioned that she was very intelligent? Now, you could say, okay, because David fancies women, so she's very beautiful. No, next point. No. Yeah, but think further. So what's the principle in that? That's what I want you to do when you look at things about Abigail. From your answers to question 1, what general principles should I apply if I'm trying to help somebody else recognize and correct their blind spots? Because this is a forgotten area of Christian discipleship. In the church, we hardly ever invite people to give us input about our blind spots. And we hardly ever feel free to comment to somebody else about their blind spots. Okay, I'll just give you 5 minutes to do that, okay? And then we'll have some feedback. So you might have to turn around or something. Okay, everybody. What I'd like you to do, please, I'm not going to ask you for your answers to question 1, because they're a bit repetitive. What I want you to do, if you haven't done this, I'm going to give you another minute or so. In your group of 4 people, what I want you to do now is write down, craft, get ready to be asked your answers to question 2. What general principles should I apply if I'm trying to help somebody recognize and correct their blind spots? So just go with that. I'll give you another minute or so, and then we'll have some feedback. Okay, everybody. All right, anybody like to share on behalf of your group of 4 what you came up with? We have quite a lot of time, so the ball really is in your part of the field. Anybody want to share what principles? Otherwise, I'll just ask you certain principles. I'll ask you and help you to arrive at them. Yep, down here. If you keep your hand up, please, so that...
So I think one of the principles of this could be that to get through to someone in their very narrow view of reality is to do something very, very obviously not in their reality. Something that is incredibly kind and that doesn't fit the narrative that they have, which means you have to understand the narrative that they have. So when you're able to do that, when you're able to very, very clearly do something that is kind, unexpected, perhaps even enjoyable, you're able to, in a sense, make them aware of what they're not seeing, even if they're not able to articulate that. And then if you're able to very, very gently and humbly bring up what's happening, not hiding it, but very honestly just mentioning it and reasoning through, I think that would be a really good way to help people become aware of blind spots.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Excellent. Anybody else? You may want to say what you've just heard slightly differently, because that often happens. Yeah.
Meeting the physical needs of someone before spiritual needs is a good way to build trust. I just think in David's past, he probably doesn't have a lot of trust. And so just, bringing food and kind of creating that bridge before you really enter into a really sensitive spot, I think is healthy.
Okay, thank you very much. Anybody else? Because this is, when you're married, your answers to this question will determine how successfully or otherwise you are helping your partner, your spouse, to move on. That's why we're doing this. It's not just kind of filling in a few minutes. It's really important. Anybody else?
We also talked about that it's very important to meet the person in humility. So it's not about Abigail and that she has the right opinion and that she's telling David, you were wrong, but it's about David, and she meets him with respect and with a humbling and serving attitude, and it's about the benefit of David and not about herself.
Yes, thank you very much. One of the major principles in helping other people, which sometimes as Christians we get back to front, is meeting them at their point of need and interest, not at our point. So very often when we are trying to share the gospel with people, build a relationship with people, we know that their greatest need is to hear about Jesus. So we want to talk a lot about Jesus. That may not be their greatest felt need. And Jesus often in the Gospels, if you think back to the woman of Samaria, if you think back to Nicodemus, Jesus related to people at the point of their need and their sort of view of their own need, their view of what they were interested in, not what was on his agenda. So he didn't begin with what he felt was important. He began with where they were at. You know, if you knew who I was, I'd give you water, you'd never be thirsty again. Wow. Boy, I get fed up coming out here every morning. Tell me where I can get this water. Yeah.
I just noticed that she didn't make it confrontational. She went without telling her husband, and so making it one-on-one instead of what we tend to do of trying to be the peacemaker, of bringing two opposite sides together, but coming in the middle and not making it confrontational.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Anyone else? Yeah, down here. Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon.
She does something that isn't necessarily going to be perceived as morally right by the community around her. And she's willing to do that for the spiritual and mental benefit of David.
Thank you very much. What a fascinating thought. That what she did was probably not understood by most people. Yep.
So one of the things that kind of stood out to me later on, David praises Abigail for her discretion. And that word stood out just in the fact that, kind of building on what was said before, she came to him. She didn't wait for David and his men to come to her. She met him in his place, in his comfortable place.
Excellent. Thank you. Maybe one more, and then I'll just ask you some questions to think about.
So in verse 18 it says Abigail acted quickly, so she recognizes David's blind spot, but she doesn't let it become a bigger thing than it needs to be. Might be kind of far-fetched as well, but she sends food on ahead, and I think food is something that people come together over and find unity in. So she's trying to find just an informal context to try and deal with this blind spot.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, loads of things there that you said that were excellent. There are several things going on inside of David. If you remember, the start of the problem was that he wanted payment for what his men had done in protecting the flocks of Nabal. The payment would not have been in cash, because Nabal says, why should I give my sheep and my water to some guy coming from who knows where? So David was going to be paid in food and in stuff to drink, which is exactly what Abigail takes to him. In other words, she recognizes the legitimate needs that David has, and one of the root needs in terms of why the whole thing's kicked off in the first place. Why does this person have a blind spot? Why is this area something that they can't see? Secondly, as many of you pointed out, she is incredibly humble when she comes to David. It's interesting that she calls David my Lord 14 times in this brief encounter. She also calls herself your servant 6 times. In other words, this is identifying that another area that was ticking David off was the lack of respect that Nabal was showing him. And so she's smart and understands why David has got into the place he's got. And not verbally, but practically, she answers those problems. The other thing that I think is fascinating is that she doesn't tell her husband, which some of you mentioned. Why doesn't she tell her husband, who's also got a massive blind spot? Because he's an idiot and won't listen. And so there are certain people you are wasting your time trying to alert them to their blind spots. You know, she goes at the right time, she goes in the right way, etc. So there are many, many principles that we could see there. We're not going to have time, or I don't think you're going to have time to write all these things down. But like I said, you can download them or you can come and take a photograph of them. Do you admit you probably have blind spots? Do you cry out to God to show you what they are? Do you have people in your life to whom you've given the freedom to show you your blind spots? Fairly regularly, Barbara and I say to each other something like this. Barbara, if I wasn't going to become defensive, and I wasn't going to say, well, you've some room to talk, and I wasn't going to become arrogant, but I was just going to listen and say nothing, what one thing could I do which would make life better for you? Now, that's not saying what are my blind spots, but it's asking, you know, what's one area that you see in me, if I was willing to change, life would be better for you? What systems do you have in place in your church, your business, your organization to flag up blind spots? When was the last time you really listened to somebody and changed your mind and actions as a result? When did your church organization last radically change anything? If you're a leader, who significantly challenges you when you need it? How do you normally respond to them? Now, I would suggest that for most Christians, the answer to all of those would be, duh. In other words, you know, I never even thought about that. Let me just say one final thing and give a couple of illustrations, and then we are through. We really need to listen in order to suspect that we may have blind spots and see what and where they are. I've just put some verses down there. There is a great emphasis in this chapter, especially when Abigail gets involved, on listening. So, verse 24, she fell at his feet and said, "My Lord, let the blame be on me alone. Please let your servant speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say. Please listen to what I'm saying." And then she goes on in verse 25, "Pay no attention to that wicked man Nabal." In other words, there are some people you should be listening to, there are some people you shouldn't be listening to. And then verse 35, David accepted from her hand what she had brought to him and said, "Go home in peace. I have heard your words." How different that is to Nabal. Do you remember what Nabal's servants said when they reported what's going on to Abigail in verse 17? "Now think it over," they're talking to Abigail, "and see what you can do, because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. He is such a wicked man that nobody can talk to him. He doesn't listen to anybody." And so listening to other people, really listening to other people, is one of the fundamental things of discovering your blind spots. Let me tell you a story and then give you an illustration, and then we're through. Years and years and years ago, the network of railways in the United Kingdom was called British Rail. It was run by the government, and it was just a mess. And one day, the directors of British Rail wanted to relaunch and rebrand their company. And so they booked a leading advertising agency in Britain called Saatchi & Saatchi. And two of the directors of Saatchi & Saatchi went along to meet the directors of British Rail. I beg your pardon, turn that around. That's completely wrong. The two of the directors of British Rail went to meet Saatchi & Saatchi in their offices. And they turned up, it was 5 to 9, and the appointment was for 9 o'clock. And so when they arrived, there was nobody on the reception, so they ring the bell, and a lady comes out who's chewing gum. And she says, "Yeah, what do you want?" And they said, "I beg your pardon?" She said, "What do you want?" They said, "Well, we have an appointment with Saatchi & Saatchi at 9 o'clock this morning." She said, "Oh, yeah, I know about that." She said, "Just take a seat, please." So they sit down, nothing happens. We get to 9:15. These guys are getting majorly ticked off. So they go and ring the bell again, and the woman comes out, still chewing gum, and she says, "Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, really sorry, but they're involved in something. Could I get you something to drink?" And they both gave their orders. One asked for a latte coffee, one asked for a decaf tea. She wanders off, she comes back with 2 cups, with stuff sloshed in the cups. She plonks it down in front of them. It's not a latte coffee, she's given them a cappuccino, and it's not a decaf tea, it's an ordinary tea. At this point, these guys have had enough. So they say, "Okay, thank you." And they're walking out when they hear laughter. They turn around and go back into the big reception area, and they notice that of the offices that open onto the reception area, there are people looking out the offices. They are now furious when one of the Saatchi brothers walks out to them and says, "I'm really sorry that we had to put you through that. But we wanted you to actually firsthand experience for 20 minutes what your customers in British Rail experience every day of their lives. Promises that aren't kept, service that is crummy, issues raised that are completely ignored. Now you've experienced what that feels like. Let's go and sit down and talk about rebranding and relaunching British Rail." Let me show you a picture very quickly. We looked at this, didn't we? I'll go through this. Just want to show you something fast, if I can get it up. It's called the Johari Window. And when I first presented this at Capernwray, some people thought I'd joined the Hare Krishna movement or something. You know, the Johari Window. It's not weird at all. It was just developed by two sociologists. One guy's name was Joseph, first name, and the other guy's first name was Harold. So the Johari Window. And it's just your typical sort of quadrant with two axes. And the axes are things known to me, that's the vertical, I beg your pardon, things known to others about me, and the horizontal one is things that I know about me. And there are 4 quadrants. The left quadrant is things I know about me and other people know about me. That's an area where I'm open. The bottom left-hand corner is things that other people know, that I know about me, that other people don't know about me. That's an area that's hidden. The top right-hand corner is things that I don't know about me that other people know about me. That's where I have a blind spot. And the bottom right-hand corner is stuff that neither other people nor me know about me. Here's the final thing. How do you increase the area of openness? These guys were looking at how people have great relationships with other people. And they discovered that the greatest relationships are when you know about me, I know about me, so you're dealing with the real me. How do you increase that area? Well, in terms of areas that I've hidden from you, I have to be more courageous and tell you stuff about me. You don't know this. This isn't true. I'm just making this up. You don't know this, but when I was coming into work this morning, I was nearly involved in a massive car crash. I'm strung out. I'm not feeling great. So I'm going to be a bit sensitive this morning. You don't know about me. I've not told this a lot of people, but when I was growing up, I was abused, and that's really affected me. So you need to know that about me, so that if I suddenly go quiet, it's because you've probably touched something in my past. The more open we are with people, the more easier it is for them to deal with us. But the top right-hand corner, the area where I am blind to myself, that becomes less and less and less as I ask for feedback from other people, and I listen carefully to what they say. All right, I went on a minute over there. I apologize. Okay, we're going to have a 10-minute break, and then I'm not quite sure what the next session is, but I'm sure you know. All right, we'll see you later on. Thank you.